Over time, people regret what they didn't do more than what they did do. Regrets of inaction are far more common than regrets of action. Hey everyone, I'm Larry Holm, and welcome to What About Grief? That quote we started with was from the book The Power of Regret by Dan Pink. And if you haven't guessed, regret and guilt is the topic of this month's podcast. Almost 3 years have passed since my wife Sarah died after her 21-month battle with cancer. Since then, during my own journey through grief, I've experienced feelings of regret at times. Those thoughts of the would've, should've, could've variety. I try very hard not to dwell on them because they can easily turn into a grief ambush at any moment. Sarah and I had made so many decisions during that period, with input from her doctors and trusted family and friends. What treatments will she be doing? Do we have another operation? Which doctor and hospitals to pick? They felt correct at the time, but my guess is no one ever makes these time-sensitive, life and death decisions without looking back on them and later questioning them. So do I experience regret and guilt at times? Of course I do. Here are some examples of what I'm sure we all could list as regrets or feelings of guilt we experience. Was I doing as much as I could? Why didn't I try and understand more of what you were going through? Was I selfish at times? Why didn't I love that person more while they were alive? Why didn't I spend more time with that person? Why didn't I listen and understand you more? Why didn't I say, I love you more? And these examples could go on, couldn't they? For me, slowly the healing is taking place, and I found that with time, I'm able to reflect, understand, and cope with these emotions in a healthier way. The loss of a loved one can be packed with regret, or guilt, or both. But what is the difference between these two emotions when they are experienced leading up to and after a death? Was it guilt while the person was alive and regret once they died? Or was it the opposite? Or was it both? So confusing, no doubt. Don't worry, you aren't alone in trying to figure this out. I was recently reading an article on regret by today's guest, and it described how regret and guilt are two different emotions, often experienced by those mourning the loss of a loved one. It felt like a great topic to explore here on the podcast because it's important to know the difference between regret and guilt in order to find the best way to cope. So, I'd like to welcome the author, Litsa Williams. She's program director and co-founder of What's Your Grief, a website devoted to grief education with resources to help individuals cope with and understand this complex topic. Litsa and her co-founder, Eleanor Haley, have a new book out called What's Your Grief? Lists to help you through any loss. We'll hear about that book a little bit later. But first, thanks for joining us today, Litsa.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, so Litsa, first off, tell us how you ended up dedicating your professional life to this topic of grief.
So that's a really good question. I think some people have a really nice, neat, tidy, linear story about how maybe they went through a loss themselves and they got professional support and it was so meaningful that it inspired them to go on and work in this field. And that was actually sort of the opposite of my experience. I lost my dad when I was a teenager. When I was 18, my dad died. And, I had really pretty bad experiences with grief support, all the way from the social worker in the hospital through my efforts to get counseling afterwards. And I was never really drawn to the idea of working in grief and loss. I think because I had a really limited perspective on what grief support looked like. My interest was really in kind of doing it differently. I had been working with so many people, both in homeless services and then later when I was working with families who had experienced traumatic and unexpected deaths, which was my primary area of work for about 8 years before founding What's Your Grief. Who just didn't want counseling and support groups. Like that wasn't their grief style. That wasn't what they were interested in. There were tons of great counseling and support groups that were out there, and I didn't really feel the need to recreate that wheel. But I was really interested in what happens to everybody who doesn't fall into that category of wanting that type of grief support. And so that's really where What's Your Grief was born. We kind of developed out of looking at all the research and coping options and things that we could put out into the grief space that would allow people who are looking for either an alternative to counseling and support groups or a supplement to their counseling and the support groups that they go to find a space that would really resonate for them and give them some other ways to tend to their own grief.
Let's dive into this a little bit more. So define, because you do it so well in that article, the difference between guilt and regret and how you describe each emotion and what is the difference between the two?
Sure. I'll preface this by saying there is not one consistent definition that is used across
Sure.
the mental health space for things like guilt and regret and shame and all these different related topics. But for me, I think the really important distinction is that we often feel guilt when we look back at things where we made a mistake, we feel we harmed someone, we did something in a way that involved an intentionality where we knew at the time that what we were doing either could cause harm, could potentially cause harm, might not be consistent with our values, and yet we did it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And regret is something that comes up when we look back and we are devastated by the outcome of something. We wish that we had done something differently. We wish that something had turned out differently. But when we look back, we realize we were doing the best we could with what we had at the time. We didn't have the intention to cause harm. We maybe didn't have knowledge or information that would have allowed us to make a different type of decision. Or, it was simply that we had no control over that situation. And in those cases, when we look back, what we're feeling is often deep regret about what happened. But it's a little bit different than that guilt that has some of that intentionality about who our past self was and what we were doing at the time.
And you can experience them both, correct? I mean, obviously, depending on the situation.
Absolutely. You can absolutely experience them both because, oftentimes we wish that things had turned out differently and there's a guilt that is connected with that. But sometimes we are experiencing them independently.
Mm-hmm. I think I was trying to think of examples, and I have plenty in my own life when dealing with my wife Sarah's cancer journey, and I'll just share one and be pretty vulnerable here. At 9:00 at night, Sarah would take her last round of pills, and I would give them to her, and then she would go to bed. And one night, after a long day of me doing my normal 9 to 5 job and taking care of the house and taking her to, physical therapy or a doctor's appointment. I can't remember exactly, but, I went in, gave her her pills, and I was like, oh, I can finally just kind of have some time now, just turn on the TV and not have to worry and just kind of relax. And I hear this, Larry, can you come into the room? And she's like, do you mind just reading this prayer from this book that she enjoyed that kind of just calmed her down and helped her sleep? And it's like a 2-minute read, but I kind of stormed in there. I read the prayer with like no feeling at all and just kind of zipped through it and then went out into the TV room and just was very selfish. And I sat down and I felt such guilt because here is Sarah going through a very tough battle with cancer. And all she asked was for me to read this prayer and help her. And I was just focusing on my, I've had such a long day of doing everything. And I just felt such guilt. And now, in the moment, and now I can look back and have such regret. And I just sometimes, feel horrible because of that. And I think we all probably feel that guilt and regret at times in certain situations.
Oh, unquestionably. And what's incredible is that we are so much harder on ourselves than we often
Mm,
are on other people. Like, I can imagine that if someone you love and care about told you that story and they were in your place, they did that thing, there is such a good chance you would be able to extend them this compassion to be able to say, you were struggling too in different ways,
right.
obviously, than Sarah, but you had so much on you. There was this strain, we could extend all of that understanding that you were both probably doing the best you could with what you had at the time. And also you could have done better, right?
Hmm.
Like, those two things can be true at the same time. And we can often extend that to other people, but it can be so hard to extend it to ourselves, like that self-compassion, to be able to see in those moments that oftentimes bring up the most guilt and regret. It's often because we were struggling too.
Yeah. Yeah. And, those two emotions are in our everyday life, but does guilt and regret always come when one is grieving? Is it a given or is it per person?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it is very common. I think there are very few people who look back after someone is gone and don't have at least some moments where they say, I wish I'd said I love you more. I wish I had been willing to watch that TV show that they loved that I hated.
Mm.
That, I wish that there was more time that we had spent together. But some people certainly feel much heavier guilt and regret, sometimes around things with the illness or the way that a person died, or really fraught things within the relationship. There are things that can make that a lot more intense. But I think everybody has a little bit of it, because once someone is gone, we feel like, wow, anything that we'd hoped for, anything we wanted more of, one more conversation, we always wish for that. And I think that allows us often to go back and think, could I have done something differently that would have given me a little bit more?
Yeah. So do you think regret is connected to our self-concept or the difference between our ideal self and the actual self?
Oh, absolutely. I think we oftentimes have this version of who we wish we had been
Mm,
to a person or within a relationship, this idealized self that we all wish that we could be. And when we don't live up to that, there's always going to be a little bit of beating ourselves up for falling short, especially when we don't have any more redos, right? Like, that person is gone and we may continue to get better because of the mistakes we made and the missteps and the things that we feel guilt and regret about. And yet that adds this other layer of loss, feeling like they're never even going to be here to see me get better, right? Like, they're
mm,
not going to see that this made me better. And that carries its own loss. And so I think oftentimes there's that comparison there. And so we're more likely and sometimes more predisposed to guilt and regret if we do already have maybe a more negative self-concept. If we already don't feel great about ourselves, we can find ourselves beating ourselves up even more, blaming ourselves more,
self-blame.
feeling,
Yeah.
yes, so much self-blame. And that's where, it's important to we don't talk as much about it, but between guilt and shame, right? Guilt is being able to say, I made a mistake, not I am a mistake. Or, I in that moment, I wasn't a great partner or husband, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't a great husband and partner overall, right? It's being able to see that we can make a mistake in one moment that doesn't change the essence of who we are. And that's important too, when we're grieving, to look at, are we allowing this guilt to not just be about discrete moments, but actually has it changed our whole self-concept, and now we feel like we're less of a person than we felt we were before.
Hmm. And how do we do a reality check on our regret? I mean, how do we check in with ourselves and gauge how we're doing?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things can be helpful. One thing we always suggest to people is really, and this is so concrete and simple, but to try to make a list of your guilts and regrets and try to tease those out from each other a little bit. Try to do that work of going, okay, maybe I've been lumping all these things together, but can I look at the things where I really was doing the best I could with what I had? I didn't have information. Maybe I've been using hindsight bias or counterfactual thinking. Hindsight bias is when it's just basically the mental health word for hindsight is 2020, right?
Mm,
We take information that came later and we look back and we think that things were obvious. So one thing that'll happen, I hear this so often, right? I can't believe I didn't make him go to the hospital. He told me he was having this terrible headache. I should have forced him to go to the ER.
right.
Well, it's easy to say that when you find out later that it was a brain bleed.
Mm,
But for most people, if your partner tells you they're having a headache, the next logical step isn't pushing them to go to the emergency room,
yeah.
right? But we use that hindsight bias. So sometimes investigating our thinking and looking at that. And so creating a list for yourself, but also this is why it can be helpful to process and reality test with other people. Sometimes when we share with other people our deep guilt and our deep regret, they can help to extend a little of that self-compassion that we're having a hard time showing ourselves. And doing a little of that reality testing and saying, are you sure that you might not be putting a little bit extra blame on yourself that isn't really rational or isn't really logical? Sometimes they can see that in a way that we can't. That's why therapists can be helpful, support groups can be helpful. They give a place to do some of that reality testing. And then over time to look at how things are progressing with learning to live with and carry that guilt and regret. One thing that you mentioned was being conscious about how often you're getting stuck in those coulda, woulda, shoulda cycles or ruminating about things. It can be helpful to build an awareness of how much time am I spending just getting lost in thoughts about this. Some people will find that they're spending hours just getting lost and beating themselves up and using that rumination and guilt as almost a form of self-punishment to just
mm,
go over it again and again and again. And if you're working on trying to change your relationship with guilt and regret, it can be really helpful to say, how do I change from using some of this time as self punishment to instead using some of this guilt and regret as a momentum to put something positive into the world in their memory, or to do something that I do feel like is helping with my growth or their legacy or my connection to them? We call this making a living amends rather than punishing ourselves. Um, as a way to feel like we're moving forward with this guilt and regret instead of letting it really keep us stuck in the past.
mm. And it's hard and it's ugly work, right? I mean, you're really turning yourself inside out and being honest with yourself. And like we talked about beforehand, I mean, your ego, right? I mean, some people don't want to admit some of the feelings or actions that they did.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the things that can be so hard about guilt and regret is that it is often we keep it in our locked up in a box where we
Mhm.
feel like we can't let anyone see it. I can say, as from working as a grief therapist with folks, I will sometimes meet with somebody for months before suddenly they are willing to share something that has clearly been tearing them apart inside
Mhm.
about a guilt or a guilt issue that is there for them. But they had been so worried about judgment, even from a therapist, that until we had enough trust and rapport and they felt confident that I wasn't going to judge them, would they bring it into the therapy office? And so I think oftentimes it's hard to get outside of our heads about it if we're not willing to be vulnerable and open. But sometimes if you're not there yet, even just writing, there's this great, unbelievably well-researched 4-day writing exercise by James Pennebaker, who's a really well-known journaling researcher, where what he just has you do is each day for 4 days, you just write for 15 to 20 minutes about that thing that is weighing on you.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly the same thing each day in a row.
Oh, wow.
And you do it 4 days in a row. And they've been researching this for decades in so many different areas. And it's unbelievable how in just 4 days, people are able to make some movement in the way that they think about it. You're able to see things sometimes differently than you could. Your thoughts start to shift around it, and something can sometimes start to loosen up a little bit. In your
Maybe
own
answer
thinking.
some of those questions that they've had, right? I mean, they answer it
Absolutely.
themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it can be a little bit of a more productive way of approaching it rather than just, oh, sometimes something reminds me of it and then I get activated by it and upset, and then I try to avoid thinking about it again. And, I'm in that cycle of I'm in conflict with my guilt and regret. This can be a way to kind of lean into it that can be a little bit more constructive sometimes.
You're listening to the What About Grief podcast. We will get back to the conversation in a moment, but I wanted to remind you that you can write to us at the show with your thoughts, ideas, or a description of your own grief journey. We appreciate hearing from you, and we like being connected with our listeners. So please reach out to us via email at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com. Also, if you like the podcast and find it helpful, please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating, hit the subscribe button, and leave a review. All of this helps us grow the podcast and helps new listeners find the show. And share the link with those you know who are experiencing their own grief. The goal of the podcast is to help those like us navigate the confusing emotion that is grief. So, what are some of the other specifics on coping with regret as opposed to coping with guilt?
Yeah, I think one of the things that can be helpful when we're looking at regret is an acknowledgement that oftentimes the reason we have been holding on to our regret and sometimes thinking of it as something we had more control over than we did is that we really, as humans, want control. We thrive when we feel like we are in control of things. We thrive when we feel like if we make a mistake, we can go back and deconstruct it and figure out where we screwed up so that the next time we can not make the same mistake or do it differently or do it better. And oftentimes with regret, these are moments where we did the best we could with what we had, right? Maybe we did CPR on the person after that heart attack or when we found them, and we made all of our best efforts. We called 911. We did all the right things, and yet still what happened was not what we wanted. The outcome was that the person died, and that we sometimes have to accept the things that we don't have control over. And that is so tough because the world is a really chaotic and unpredictable place when we acknowledge just how many things we don't have control over, or the reality that we can do everything quote unquote right and still we might not get the outcome that we wanted or that we hoped for. So I think one of the things that we can practically work on is a little bit of that, what they call intolerance of uncertainty, which is just how do we get more comfortable with the reality that we don't have as much control as we think? How do we start to dig into our own histories to say, where does our need for control come from? Where did we develop that in our childhoods? They found that the people who feel most in need of control are often the people who have the hardest time adjusting in uncertain, difficult, unpredictable, stressful situations like illnesses and death and grief. So sometimes doing a little bit of that work can be a helpful place for us to start. And with that, to do a little bit of sometimes self-forgiveness work. A lot of times with those regrets we've been feeling, we've been blaming ourselves. We've been carrying more on us
Mm.
rather than acknowledging that there were things outside of our control. So sometimes being able to say, wow, like I really have been beating myself up for things that I didn't have control over, and how now can I be kinder to myself, let go of some of those ways I've been beating myself up, and acknowledge that it really wasn't maybe my fault in the way I've been thinking it was.
Yeah. And that might help your brain to kind of quiet down the what ifs and if onlys, right? I mean, that are constantly zipping through our mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Those what ifs and those if onlys are often our brain's way again of trying to put a narrative structure to what happened, a logic and an order. And
Yeah.
can I do that so that the future can feel safer for me in some way? That I figured out the story and where things went wrong the last time. And so sometimes if we can accept that there is, unfortunately, not that control, there's not that thing we could have done, it does quiet down our minds a little bit if we can get to that place. You can also practice other things if you really find that you're somebody who does ruminate a lot or you get stuck in those cycles. I know for some people they're like meditation, that feels woo woo, or that doesn't feel like it's really going to make a difference. But meditation is really that practice of changing our relationship with our thoughts. It's when thoughts come up, it's being able to learn that we don't have to follow them, that we
Mm.
don't have to go down that rabbit hole. And that is not natural for us as humans. We
Mhm.
often, a thought comes up and we just chase that thought, we
Yeah.
run with it. So it is like, I tell people all the time, it's like going to the gym, like starting a meditation practice. You got to do it regularly. You're going to build up. It's going to be slow. But when you start to see the progress, it's going to be really remarkable because it will help you to change that relationship with some of those really hard guilt and regret thoughts, and be able to say, oh, you know what? I notice it. I see that's my guilt bubbling up. That's my regret bubbling up. And now I'm going to decide what I'm going to do with it right now. I'm going to decide whether I'm going to go down that rabbit hole, or whether maybe I can make a decision to move in a different direction that feels more consistent with my values, that feels more consistent with the legacy and memory of that person and who I'm trying to be in the world right now.
Yeah. In your practice, I'm sure you speak with a lot of people who have various types of grief that they're experiencing, and I'm sure you've come across a lot of different types of guilt. And there's one that we all talk about, even if we're not grieving, but it's survivor's guilt. Talk to us about how heavy that must feel if you're experiencing survivor's guilt.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Survivor's guilt is so complex. And one thing I always like to mention when survivor's guilt comes up is sometimes when people hear that, they think of survivor's guilt as in a really narrow way. Like, oh, if we were both in a car accident and I survived and the other person didn't. But survivor guilt extends to anyone who is living in the world without a person who they believe should still be here.
Mm.
And that can happen in so many different types of losses. So sometimes people feel like they don't have permission to call what they're feeling survivor guilt because they think it's really narrow, but we see it in so many different types of losses. And what is, I think, oftentimes helpful for us to remember is that it's our pain is, it's not our connection, or it's certainly not our only connection.
Mm.
And oftentimes we feel like we don't deserve to enjoy things in the world when this person is gone. We feel like if we are doing that, that somehow we must be forgetting them, or that must mean that our connection to them is diminishing, or we wouldn't be able to enjoy and savor things in the world without them here. And as we change our relationship with guilt in general, but also I think with grief in general, and we start to realize as time progresses that our pain is not our only connection, that our connection is actually all of our memories. It's knowing that we are who we are because this person was part of our life and, part of our life. And that because this person shared part of our life, that as we go forward, we can have kind of a co-destiny, right? Where we appreciate and savor the life we have in their honor. And, every day we may be grieving that they're not here to be able to live this life with us like we always imagined that they would, but that our doing it is not a betrayal to them. It can actually be an honoring of them and who they were and how they left an imprint on us and the world that we want to keep carrying through in a way that feels meaningful and feels like it really is a tribute to who they were. And that's hard work. Like it's not easy
Yeah.
with that survivor guilt to get there. It doesn't come quickly. But I think sometimes when we really think about what our continued bonds are, what our connections are, what our legacy is, and we start to count all the ways that it's more than our pain, that allows us sometimes to see our life moving forward as co-destiny of us kind of taking them with us as we move forward.
Yeah. I don't know if this falls under survivor's guilt, but I think one thing I regret looking back is I'd wish I talked to Sarah more in the moment about what was she really thinking about and experiencing through her own journey of cancer. And did she think it would take her life? Or verbally, she would always say, I'm going to beat this. And I believed her, and I didn't want to always bring up death because I wanted her to feel like I was 100% behind her and we were going to beat this. But, looking back, I wish I had spent more time, though, kind of getting her thoughts on what she was experiencing. And also, if she had any thoughts for me, if she did pass away, on how I should move forward after that. And so, again, I don't know if that falls under survivor's guilt, but I was just, it just kind of popped into my mind that that's one thing. Hey, listeners, spend time with your loved one if they are sick or going through something traumatic. Find out what is really going through their mind, because once they're gone, you can't turn the clock back.
Yeah, I think you're certainly not alone in feeling that. And I'll also share, because Eleanor, the co-founder of What's Your Grief, she would be angry at me if I didn't share. One thing she says all the time is, we want to open up space when people are sick or dying for them to be able to share those things. And also, some people who are sick and dying don't want to share those things. They
Mm,
want to focus on survival. They want to focus on the positive. They aren't in a space. And so we often have to take our cues from them and honor the way that they are going through their own process
yeah.
and journey. And in the place that you're in now, I think the thing that can be important is to recognize the guilt or regret that you feel about it now, but also try to have some like self-compassion for who past Larry was then. Like, what were the reasons maybe that was hard, to try to really empathize with who you were in that moment, what was happening, and how you see it differently now
Hmm.
from this moment looking back. But then use all of that information to go, okay, and now how does this inform me going forward? What will this mean when it comes to the time of my own death, or having another family member or friend who is in the place Sarah was? How will I use what I've learned from that, in memory of her, as part of her legacy, to say, wow, I didn't do it in exactly the way I wish I had with her. And that's going to help me to hopefully do it better the next time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's some really good advice. Thank you for that. You mentioned your partner, Eleanor, you guys just wrote a book called What's Your Grief? Lists to help you through any loss. Tell us how this evolved, how this came about, and how we can get it.
Sure. So we'd been writing for the website for a decade before this book came to be. And one of the things we always heard from people who found our site was I had a dozen grief books and I couldn't read more than 3 pages. And
I can
then,
relate.
right. And then I found your website and it was perfect because it was these bite-sized articles and I could click around to the things that were relevant to me and just read those things and get helpful information in a bite-sized dose. So when a publisher approached us about doing a book, we were really hesitant because previous publishers had approached us and they really wanted like the same old grief book. And we were like, we don't need to add to that. There's plenty of those out there. But when we finally had a publisher come to us who said, this thing you've captured in the website that has, you've millions of people who come to the site who read these articles, can you capture that in a book? And we thought a lot about it. And we really approached this book in a way that was designed for people who are in that place of, I can barely concentrate, I can barely focus, I don't want to read cover to cover. And really that allowed us the advantage of the highlights of a 12, almost 12 years of doing work online in the grief space, on writing of what was most helpful, what resonated with people, working with clients directly too. But then we distilled it all down. And so the book, people always, I think like lists. Can you really write a grief book in lists? Right. The lists, I will say, they're not just bullet points, right? It is much more thoughtful lists, but it is written in a way so that you can really find the pieces that resonate. You can jump around. If one feels relevant to you, it'll tell you, all right, if this helped, go to this page, read this other stuff. And gives a little bit of an arc of just understanding grief overall, understanding modern grief theory and what we understand that's so different than all that outdated stuff like the 5 stages of grief and things that are really not grounded in particularly helpful research, and going through how to understand your own grief. What can you do as self-exploration to get to know your own grief better? And then how can you find your own coping path and know that there's not one path for coping. It doesn't always look like therapy and support groups. How do you learn to process your own guilt, your own anger, your own isolation, maybe feelings about family members and friends? Maybe it is rebuilding your identity. How do you create a unique path towards your own coping? So that's kind of the arc of the book, and it is available anywhere you buy books. Bookshop.org. We always recommend if you don't have a preference already, it lets you pick your local independent bookstore to receive the proceeds. It's cool. A nonprofit model bookstore online. So it's a great option if you are looking for a way. But it is on all the big sellers too, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all those places as well.
Well, if I'm sure the book is going to be a success, because I really love your website, whatyourgrief.com. And for you listeners who haven't ever gone to it, I highly suggest you spend some time on their website. It has resources, it has education, you can share your grief with them. There's communities and even grief recipes, which I might have to dive into because I don't know. When I'm in my grief, I want like a cheeseburger and French fries. And I hope when you're grieving, you're not eating like vegetables and healthy things, because then I'm out.
It's all about the comfort foods.
Exactly.
All about the comfort foods. Yes.
Nothing
totally.
healthy. Nothing healthy. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, I really appreciate your time. I think you have really shared some great wisdom with us, and your Instagram, your website, your book is all really, really helpful. And the topic of regret and guilt and grief is a big, heavy topic. And we just kind of touched the surface. But I really do appreciate you taking some time and sharing your thoughts with us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me and for the amazing work you're doing putting out this podcast and just reaching more people who need it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's a labor of love. Thank you, Litsa.
Take care.
In thinking and researching regret and guilt lately, I've been reminded that my grief includes memories of Sarah's smile, of our time together, and how her love and spirit lives on in those of us lucky to have known her. This podcast is a result of her legacy of helping and putting others first, and I have no regrets about that. There was a lot we discussed that we should reflect on, digest, and maybe start applying to our lives in regard to how we understand and deal with our regret, guilt, and grief. Not easy, I know, and don't beat yourself up. As Litsa said, it might take some time, but we have to start for the healing to begin. Remember, if you are experiencing grief, you are not alone. My thanks to Litsa Williams. What About Grief is available monthly on all major podcast listening platforms. Please follow the podcast as well as rate and review the show on Apple Podcast. The executive producer of What About Grief is Marsha Anderson. Logo artwork was designed by TED Studios. This episode was recorded at BAM Studios in Chicago. And lastly, feel free to email us at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com.